I'm Michael Kelleher, Director of the Windham-Campbell Prizes at Yale University. Welcome to the 2021 Windham-Campbell Prizes Virtual Festival. We'll be streaming a new episode each week for the next 9 Wednesdays. Each episode will focus on one of this year's prize recipients, and the final episode will be a keynote address by U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. While the episodes stream, you'll be able to chat with other audience members, and following the live stream, we invite you to join the writer in a live Zoom Q&A. In the week between each episode, there will be plenty of on-demand content available for you to enjoy. Today's episode features poet Canisia Lubrin, author of Voodoo Hypothesis and The Disgraphist. She will be joined by author Rinaldo Walcott for a conversation about the poetry of the Black diaspora and the legacy of enslaved Africans in the Americas, while they prepare a classic Caribbean dish of salt cod and okra.
I'm so glad to be cooking with my friend Rinaldo Walcott. Today we're going to make a very famous dish from the Caribbean, perhaps the Black diaspora. What do you call it in Barbados?
Saltfish rundown.
Saltfish rundown. We just call it saltfish in St. Lucia. Although, you know, the dish of the island is saltfish and green fig.
Yes.
So we put that on some green bananas. The dish obviously has some significance for us Black folk who descend from the formerly enslaved. So you as the master chef and I, the sous chef, I'll just let you get into it.
So yeah, I mean, as you can see, we have the saltfish, some ginger, some Scotch bonnet peppers, some thyme, bell peppers, tomatoes, and we have some okra on the side here. So what I think I'll do, I'll just start cooking.
We go a little bit higher here with the...
Yeah, I'll start cooking.
Temperature.
And, you know, because the first thing we're going to do is melt a little bit of butter and put the onions in, and then the salt cod. And whenever I cook saltfish in Toronto in Canada, it's really reminiscent of all of the ways in which the Caribbean and this place called Canada meet at the site of this particular salted cod that was fed to the slaves, right? So it's an interesting and strange experience to have cooking salt cod in Canada.
Yeah.
You know, this is a beautiful, terrible history, if you will. Salt cod, it's the thing that has come to be such a delicacy in the Caribbean. People now make, what do they call them? Fish cakes, salted cod fish cakes. But also the labor of this dish. This dish takes a little while to prepare, you know? Yeah. I mean, we're able to finesse it these days, but it does take a little bit of time to produce, and tells us something about the labor that people endured. You have to soak with saltfish to get the salt out.
Because they put a metric ton of salt in it to preserve it. Cheap food, supposedly low nutritional value.
All of that. So you begin the day before the actual cook by, you know,
by soaking it.
Then after you soak it, you still have to boil it to get more salt out.
Get all that salt out, yeah.
And then depending upon how you feel about salt, you might even have to boil it again, right?
And so we have the onions here getting soft and translucent, and I will make myself useful by having 1/2 of this.
So on the east coast of Canada, where the saltfish came from, Halifax, Nova Scotia, you know, the Grand Banks, where the cod fishery has now collapsed. The link between saltfish and rum and molasses that is so important in that part of the country, in that part of Canada, where people also then simultaneously denied that they know nothing about slavery.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting history, and you know, this kind of history tells you something about our ongoing connectedness even when we don't have the language to speak it, or even when people deny that it actually exists.
Yes.
Right?
Truly.
The fish comes as fillets, salted fillets.
Yeah, large.
Yeah.
I'm, it's interesting that you put the saltfish in before the garlic.
Because we don't want the garlic to burn.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Burnt garlic is not a good thing.
I grew up eating this in so many different configurations. And there's just something to the labor of making a dish from such a quote-unquote humble ingredient that is just so commonplace in the Caribbean. Kind of like canned sardines used to be. And there's a similar history between canned sardines and
Yes.
and the saltfish. That, to me, there's a kind of, well, for one, the history you've just elucidated certainly is one of the reasons. But I think there's a kind of parallel between that labor and the act of writing, and specifically cooking, that I find really interesting. That sort of, that moment of recognizing the thing you want to write about, and all of the labor that goes into what comes out on the page. To me, that process of preparing food is very similar.
You can feel the heat of the Scotch bonnet actually coming out of this right now.
Already, we might start coughing.
Yeah,
too.
and entering my nostrils.
There's just something to the process of cooking, where you take the raw ingredients of something and refine it using the sort of miracle of heat to then create something cohesive, hopefully, if you know what you're doing. Create something cohesive in the end that has a certain nutritional benefit. And I find writing does that in a sort of intangible way. The nutritive power of language, when you configure it into something like poetry or story, and what that reveals about what we need. Not always being boiled down to the consumable, but certainly things that, allow us to persist in our various ways. So I think there are very many parallels between cooking and writing. And I love cooking for some of the same reasons that I love writing.
And I can see that in your writing. I'm thinking about Voodoo Hypothesis and the kind of alchemy of words that come together in that collection, but also the dysgraphics and how these multiple personas of this one figure comes to occupy space in that work across these several acts. And so I can see that metaphor and how it kind of becomes this intellectual feast, if you will, of thought and action and of ethical demand.
Yes.
There's something big in your work that I think is as big as these humble dishes that got whole populations from slavery to a post-slavery world to true colonial occupation to national independence and to ongoing struggles to survive. Even as we stand here today making this dish enfolds in it this tremendous history. And I see similar kinds of things happening in your work as well, evoking that kind of big history, but not overwhelming. It doesn't overwhelm us. It commands us to do something. Like when you get these flavors here, it commands you to eat.
It really does. I'm really holding back because what I want to do is put my hand in there and taste something. You gotta let me put something in that pot at some point.
I'm gonna let you cook the okra.
I'll cook the okra. All right, cool. But then that's lovely of you to say. I think on one level, it is part of what I try to do is to bring as much of what has led to this point into the writing as possible. And so thinking of even the long emancipation, and then the way you chart what is still yet to be in that, in that desire, in that imperative for liberation and freedom. it's like the more we learn about this dish, the more it opens up what that history has been, and in the new ways I come to appreciate it.
I wouldn't dare make a correspondence between what I try to do as an academic and what you have achieved across your two works of poetry that for me are bigger than poetry. But what I would say is that there's a certain kind of question that I think Caribbean people who moved across geographies continually return to. And it's this question of freedom. And I think one of the reasons that we keep returning to it is because we come from a place where people said freedom happened. That there was something that was not freedom, and then freedom happened. And yet we find ourselves having to move to experience what might be freedom. So many of us, I recall, and I don't know if it's a myth or not, but I recall people saying that there are more Barbadians who live outside of Barbados than in Barbados, right? Yeah. And that kind of tells you something about the failed promise of that word freedom, which is why I come back to it. But in your work, in Voodoo Hypothesis, in the Disgraphics, there's also a sense of scrutability of the detail of a life and what that detail might demand of us in terms of activating logics that are larger than the regions that we come from. The Disgraphics is a world-making set of lyrics, set of acts. And that too, I believe, and maybe you will correct me if I'm reading your work incorrectly, but that too, I believe, is a very Caribbean sensibility, that we are world-making people.
Yeah.
It might be an arrogant thing to say or a conceited thing to say, but
I don't know. Sometimes necessity can look like arrogance. But I think we come from a place that sort of necessitated our manner of world making. I think in everything we do, there's a kind of gesture to the world as a made thing, because we're always improvising, trying to figure it out ourselves. Even when we know that we've inherited something, we know that somehow we have to attend to what becomes the new imperative in it. Because like you say, there's a failed promise somewhere. I remember being in high school, and they had this minister, or you could have been a former minister, come in and talk to us about globalization. This was the big thing at the time. And I remember feeling so distraught by that. I just knew that there was something to that, which presented a kind of illusion in terms of the economics that he was presenting, but also just in the sort of sociality of what we expect of people and how we make lives, how we get on. And there was this large concern about something called brain drain, because apparently everybody who knew anything according to a certain rubric was leaving the island, right? And so that was really quite interesting to graduate with those words that was somehow supposed to send us out into the world. I just think that sometimes it might seem that certain moves look arrogant, but we do the things we need, and sometimes the need is so large that you have to make a large movement.
Yeah, I think that there's a way in which Caribbean people have this tremendous sense of the global that is in many ways unmatched by many other people. And what I mean by that is that even Caribbean people might never leave the small island where they have born, might never even leave their village.
Yeah.
They can tell you stories of somebody going somewhere and coming back.
Yes.
Right? There's this tremendous sense, and then there's this tremendous sense of movement, of return, of someplace else that is further away from where you are.
Yeah.
And then, of course, that's implanted in our very culture too, right? Of people leaving to go work somewhere else, of people leaving to go farm somewhere else, of people leaving to go study somewhere else, and so on. So it was like, I've always said that one of the things, and this is the other thing about making this dish, that one of the things about the Caribbean and Canada is that Caribbean people who arrive in Canada arrive in knowing more about Canada than Canada will ever know about them. Like when I was a kid in Barbados growing up, we had to learn about the Grand Banks. We had to learn about where the salted cod came from. That was a part of our geography lessons.
Yep.
But I remember arriving in Canada as a teenager and meeting other teenagers who had never heard of Barbados. Right? So they had never heard of a whole island, a whole country. But I had learned about the Grand Banks. I had learned about Newfoundland. I had learned about Halifax and New Brunswick and the fishing cultures of the east coast of Canada because of this fish, because of slavery. And that's what I mean by Caribbean people having this sense of a worldliness that is far beyond what other people in other places actually recognize. Now, of course, your work, though, is not just about the Caribbean, but you're writing out of this, for me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're also writing out of this tradition that might be in counterpoint to and intention with the great Derek Walcott, writing out of that geography, writing out of similar kinds of geographical movements across space and time. And that in and of itself imbued a certain kind of worldliness in the work too. So
I think you're absolutely right. It's almost as though everywhere that I've been in the last 5 or so years, where poetry has taken me from, Vancouver to Kenya, there's a sense of the Caribbean in all of those places. It might be because of the sort of literary sense of the world that I have, which is also fecund, which is also in the orature of, growing up in a place where art can happen anytime in this sort of spontaneity, in the speech, in the way somebody lobs a joke at you as you walk down the street, that kind of sociality.
I like that phrase, anytime art can happen.
Yeah. There's something to the space of the Caribbean that makes you hyper aware of the artistic. Even if it's not labeled or categorized as that, there is a kind of art to being in yourself, and even when you meet people on the street who are homeless or vagrant or what have you, there's a certain poetry to them. I don't want to romanticize that. It's really not that. Is that you're unencumbered by certain value systems that point you away from people. It's like you always have to be aware of people somehow, good or bad, And I think that's why I try to, in my poetry, always, make plain how the body arrives, how all of that is embodied somehow, to speak through what happens, in thinking, in art, in whatever it is, in a kind of embodied way, And so maybe that's also why I really enjoy cooking and that process and that awareness of the body interacting with the thing that is being made.
Yeah, so we're going to steam some okra, which, as you know, came with the people who were enslaved from West Africa. So the story goes.
Yeah.
And when I was a child growing up in Barbados, almost everybody had an okra tree in their backyard. You really don't see that much now. But there's this wonderful myth about okra that I like it so much. I don't know if it's true, but the story is that enslaved African women bought okra seeds in their hair to the Caribbean. That's how the okra got to the Caribbean. That it wasn't deliberately bought.
Right.
right?
It just got stuck in their hair.
Yeah, and I like that so much. I don't know why I like that story so much, but it just, of course, marronage and fugitivity and all of these practices are really important to how Caribbean people have survived into the present. And the smuggling of the okra seeds, if you will, just seems to fit that narrative in a lovely and romantic way.
It does. And I also have a quite deep appreciation for the unknowable, for the mysterious. And so that is always something that I think there's something to Blackness that is unscrutable, and so in that, this sense of here is a kind of apocryphal, kind of origin story in which the details are not as important as the outcome,
I really think that in Voodoo Hypothesis, that sense of the inscrutable is really powerfully felt, at least for me as a reader, in that work.
That sense struck me. I don't think it's something that I orchestrated so much as I happened upon it in the act of crafting the poems there. And to your point about that inscrutability, yes, I know this, but also I don't know it. That became apparent to me, and my commitment to it only strengthened each time I felt doubt, and that it's that sort of tension, that apparent contradiction, that I think creates the register of that inscrutability, that knowing and not knowing at the same time. But it felt important to me to keep that in.
There is something about how the world imagines they know Black people and they don't know them at the same time, right?
Yes, it's true.
And the hypothesis of who they think we are continually fails them, disappoints them, and in a range of different kinds of ways.
Yes. And we see it play out in, oh my goodness, so many different ways. And it's so, I think what the popular has done, what Blackness has a popular thing that somehow found a commercial formula, whether it's rap music or, or how Black culture is taken up in the popular, gives people a certain sense of Blackness that I think is completely reductive, but it's also the point at which they're also confounded, when that predictability that they think is there doesn't play out. Like, look at even the Olympics with their endless disciplining of Black women's bodies, and so it's really interesting.
So one of the ways that I have read Voodoo Hypothesis is to replace the word voodoo with magical.
Yeah.
How did you arrive at the title?
That's an interesting story. So when I wrote the title poem, Voodoo Hypothesis, after watching the Ultimate Mars Mission, I think it's called, that story of how the NASA's Curiosity rover came to be, and how they sent it out into space. And one of the quotes that they used partly to narrate that whole thing was from John F. Kennedy, which was, space is now open before us, and our willingness to explore it is not based on the ethics of others. That notion that we know very well as colonial, post-colonial people, etc., etc. And I thought the audacity in that, even now, and to think of Dion Brand's line, how they spread across the cosmos, the hedonism in his voice. I think that's from Inventory or something. It just made me think, in sort of broad terms about where that authority comes from. And we know that it gets deployed a lot as something called God, as something called religion. and to imbue humans with this Adamic role where they name and therefore control, and therefore dominate, and have the capacity to subjugate as much as they want. That, I think, for me, and that happened late in the writing process, but it sort of brought the book together. And so I started to think of that sense of the supernatural, how it functions, why it functions, and the kind of scientific foundation of colonialism, certainly the iteration that we have now. And those two things together created an interesting kind of idea. And so in both instances, there is a kind of wishful thinking in it. And then there's also the calculable and how those things interact to create a kind of knowable unknowability. Some things can be predicted because they are predicated on something, and other things could be quote unquote predicted because we have a certain reverence for the magical, for imagination, for the speculative, and bringing those two things together side by side, how the sense of the supernatural or God or something that imbues you with authority, that's an idea, just the same as science and philosophy and all of these other things sort of create those spheres of ideas. So that's kind of where I think that's the genesis of it.
Yeah. Well, I know where the title of the Dysgraphis is a play on Christina Sharp's Dysgraphia.
Yeah.
From her book In the Wake on Blackness and Being. What inspired you about Sharp's use of that word and the ideas that are encapsulated in her use of that word?
It's a lot, Give
me the lot.
But here's the Cole's notes. I had been thinking about the role of language in thinking of how we relate, in thinking of how the world is made and unmade and remade, our sense of ourselves, and Sharp's theorizing around dysgraphia, which is in itself the kind of narratives that when she says in her formulation, the narratives that are disseminated in the media over and over and very quickly that pathologize, criminalize Black people, etc. And it's like this thing sticks, and how do we unstick it? How do we carry on living in spite of that big thing that sticks? And to think of dysgraphia as difficult writing, in its Greek orthography. For me, a poet, that was really interesting because I have a sense of language that, yes, it is very difficult. I have never thought language was simple. I'm always tangled in language, actually, and I have to do the untangling. That's where a lot of the work is for me when I write poetry, in particular. And so to miswrite, to have this sort of miswriting of us, basically, in the social sphere, that gave me a really concrete way to think about personhood, to think about what's at stake in our capacity for imagination and language, and how we make lives, how we build worlds, in spite of the sort of really destructive things out here that misrepresent us, that misalign us, and so working on that level, what was interesting for me as a poet is, what if I deliberately break the syntax of English? What kind of music does that give me? And what kind of seeing does it allow? And so I kind of arrived at that place and was hauling the registers of the dysgraphist, breaking up that English syntax, using Creole, using French, using Latin, and all of the mix of the languages that exist in our history, truly as counterpoint to the dysgraphia.
Yeah, I just heard in what you said, Kamal Brathwaite, Norbesi Phillip, Dion Brand, Derek Walcott, Earl Lovelace in the novel, Sam Salvon, Austin Clarke. You know, just a large number of Caribbean writers and thinkers who have really grappled with the language and grappled with the language as a way to kind of bring. Why do I keep saying Caribbean people? These people are something more than Caribbean people, which is not to say that the Caribbean is small, right?
No.
Or that the Caribbean, but
maybe that is.
I think it's this that got us there. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because there's a way in which, you know, I mean, the okra is a part of North American slave food, but not the saltfish per se, not the salt cod. But anyhow, that's an intertext because all of a sudden, like, why, right? I mean, like, in many registers, you are a Canadian writer. Austin is a Canadian writer. Kamal might be a Caribbean writer. People read Dion Brand as a Canadian writer. But anyhow,
we transcend.
Yeah, right. Black diaspora. Black diaspora writers have really grappled with this question of language and how to break it open and how to make it offer us another kind of insight into who we might be as Black people globally. Yeah. You know, and but in some ways, this, and we can turn this off, in some ways, this dish that we have just kind of composed together, this okra, this saltfish, does the same thing, right? It breaks open, you know, the notion of discontinuity. Yes. That in fact, the okra is continuity.
It is.
And that when we put these two together, something new opens up about, you know, the possibility of Black life, right? The curry powder that we put in here, right, is actually a mix that comes out of African enslavement, Indian indentureship, and ongoing British colonial rule, right? Yes. Because the people from the Indian subcontinent who arrived in the Caribbean didn't make curry as a powder. It came as different spices right? that you grind up together, ground and burned, and so on. So even as the food marks this terrible thing, it also marks all of these kinds of possibilities, all of these kinds of openings to other ways of sensing the world, other ways of making meaning in the world. And since I think these dishes are complete, maybe there's that moment in the Dysgraphis that you might want to read from. Yes. As a way of drawing our conversation and our cooking to a close.
Or to its climax.
Yeah, and then maybe we could eat something with the crew here.
That would be nice, I think.
It's not going to be as tasty as it should be, I apologize, but yes.
Why are you prejudging the thing?
But you know me.
I know.
I stopped grating the ginger because I got hot.
I could have continued. You see, this is the thing. Cool. Yes, I'll read from Act 6, which is an act called Ain't I a Madness? And there's something to being Black in the world that is a necessary madness. And so, page 125. Have we eaten so many salt-preserved repasts, even now, even in the middle of this day, there's no use dumping I into this bay. I, who'll bump that track when they come for you too. Will your face write willingly into the air when they are not looking? That you know I've been waiting here at this corner to see you all day. Do they search you for whatever before they make the searching illegal? What about that recipe for Mom's cold-roasted kidney? contraband of hallelujahs, the shea soap she doctored in the kitchen, good enough an anti-inflammatory aid, your mother's maiden name, some abortions. What will they say about the usefulness of their endless killing notations? What now, in this thin hour, have I faded from the miswritten main? We should eat.
We're going to end today's episode with a short reading. But before we do, I'd like to invite you to a live Zoom conversation immediately following the episode.
So I will read a few pages from Act 1 of the Dysgraphist, called Ain't I at the Gate? It is difficult to live in the dark. I knows the dark is difficult as abandoned artifacts like graveyards of ships in the blueprint of wrecked wars known to Jejun as the 11 lost in Deepwater Horizon oil and gas, ignited for 48 hours in 60,000 gallons of the dark. Permit an escape to the engineers still alive and brave in this dark. Then stop immediately, man. Then hit I again. After 84 days, a facsimile. Be sure to offer milk. Then ask Jejun whether I will cry if you die. Whether something of the pirates and all the ones they sold live here still. De causa naturel, de causa nostra. Lay I, now the younger one, bear in thoughts. Bear in eye complications. Jejun does not want it paid in simple tongue, but let I go, given the choice now to speak after 500 years of dysgraphia. Let I approach the witness stand in any chosen language. Let I bend into a touch of the supernatural. Let that be all you need to know. Where the heart is bruised with unfeeling, to delay the organs, devotion to devotion is not belief, or it is. Calling I to walk out of the sea, all of the world hears the surf supply applause. Hears Jejun swimming in, Jejun outlawed in the notes of 50 generations, far from that door of even more unopenings. How to pay for the vocal injury I feels at the end of the Gulf of Mexico. The one wrecks, seeds still in jars after a century. How the sea hacks the compass still. I feels how far is left to go. Sudan, Abaco, Aleppo still. Before the self-same notes of dead musicians, consider I more than the pen. And to have never thought of the notes as autobio. And to have never built a better world to inhabit or break. Speaking Jejun, I has screwed up, I knows it, and how to pay for it instead. I hammers the joke's humorless record with a love, a marrow. Because now, Jejun, you must hand the beacon back to I, cutting red a road through this border, before the hand with its index pointed at the temple of the complete world realizes it is not always foolish to rouse a sleepless thing, to offer pills for it to stay awake, to witness the columns of ash and smoke taking the tsunami by surprise, just as the gods who sell their dead to stay awake, before the concrete slabs close in on promises for doing better. Involuntary hours of driving toward debate, the self for minutes and hours forgets about survival and heaves a beauty from the radio. Aretha Franklin today, another voice tomorrow. That desert sugared with these wrung selves. We rush and shape stone, not carried, but accrued, where I layers its new language, taking back the miserly mouth that sours the pot. In our big beautiful, ain't the monstrous always intimate? and before any protest turns it inward, inmate into a vineyard, and there a moan digging 1,000 years into the past. As by this interruption, do you accept this collect call, this collect that call, accept the charges, how I, now the daughter, is here forgetting the voice of her father, or whomever the father voiced, magnum mi facit dominus, dwindling away some rubbery word for fire, or a glance back to something sincere. Jejun, all of these words inflate our undivided lives anyway. So now, I counsels at the inroads how to cart through what could be too much to confess. Raise a hand if you know what kind of body lives in another kind of mouth. A whole life with the same friends, in the same house, the same lovers, dance of the same dance, to have eaten the same, the walking, passing, sobbing, the same, dog-crowded parks, black and pink beaches, some love for words, the mod script of algebra, language of oil, a madhouse, real, watch with deafness, the gabled roof, fences, cars, the many-rooted book. So that is enough, as all exception must be. Refuse entry into this collection. If all this sophistry is meaningless, speech, branching out of shipwreck, some altered sense, Jejun and I find the highest point in the city. We rub our eyes with juniper and thought of states, merely recognizable by their vulnerable curves into nothing, or nothing of what was said before survives. Past a tug, not persuasive, but a tug on exhausted neural membranes, crossing streets, cutting a new ideogram for volcanic jackdaws, all of the journey now, the fate of everything dubbed unclean. And we vote to enjoy the view that we know is indifferent to our love. Jejun, all of these words are our dark twin. Anyway. Thank you.